The world tilted, sound receding to a dull roar in my ears, replaced by the frantic thumping of my own heart. My grandmother's voice, usually so full of warmth and stories of her prize-winning roses, was a thin, fragile thread over the phone, choked with disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. She told me David, the nice young man, the one who had been so helpful, so kind, had vanished. And with him, every last cent of her life savings. Gone. Wiped out. A cold, venomous fury, unlike anything I'd ever experienced, coiled in my stomach and shot through my veins like ice water. My sweet, gentle grandma, who wouldn't harm a soul, who trusted too easily because she judged everyone by her own good heart. Robbed. By him. This David. This predator. He thought he'd found an easy mark. He thought he could just slither away into the shadows with her security, her peace of mind. A bitter laugh almost escaped me. He had no idea. He didn't know that her granddaughter wasn't just some concerned relative. I was a lawyer, a damn good one, known for dismantling opponents twice my size in courtrooms and boardrooms. He had scammed my grandma. He didn't realize he'd just declared war on someone who played to win and played dirty if necessary. He didn't realize I was utterly, terrifyingly ruthless when provoked. My name is Sarah Jenkins. By day, I navigated the cutthroat landscape of corporate law in a bustling city. I was a litigator, which meant my entire career was built on argument, on dissecting complex problems, on finding the fatal flaw in an opponent's case, and exploiting it without mercy. My colleagues respected me. Some were a little intimidated by my intensity. I lived in a minimalist apartment, a stark contrast to the chaos of my professional life. A place where I could meticulously plan my next move, whether it was for a billion-dollar merger or, as it turned out, for personal vengeance. My mind was my greatest weapon, sharp, analytical, and relentless. I was, by all accounts, a successful young woman, driven and ambitious. But there was another side to me, a softer side that very few saw. That side belonged to my Grandma Elsie. She was my rock, my connection to a gentler, kinder world. She lived in the same little yellow house she'd shared with my grandpa for over 50 years, a place that always smelled of cinnamon and old books. Her garden was her pride and joy, a riot of color and fragrance. After Grandpa passed, our bond grew even stronger. Every Sunday, I'd escape the city's concrete jungle and drive out to her, shedding my lawyer skin at her doorstep. We'd drink tea from her floral china cups, she'd tell me stories of her youth, and I'd just breathe. She represented everything good and pure, a stark contrast to the often cynical and predatory world I battled in professionally. Her understanding of modern finance was almost non-existent. She still wrote checks for everything and considered ATMs to be marvels of futuristic technology. This naivety, so endearing, also made her terribly vulnerable. I was fiercely protective of her, a silent guardian against a world I knew could be cruel. Little did I know, the cruelty was about to knock on her door, wearing a charming smile. The first insidious seed was planted on a sunny Sunday afternoon. Grandma Elsie was practically bubbling over with enthusiasm, her usually calm demeanor animated. She told me she'd met the most wonderful young man, a real gentleman named David. He'd been at the local senior center, she explained, giving a presentation on financial planning for retirees. He was so articulate, so understanding of their needs, she'd gushed. He'd even offered, out of the sheer goodness of his heart, to pop by her house and help her make sense of some confusing bank statements she'd been stressing over. He'd not only done that but also fixed a dripping faucet and brought her a beautiful orchid. My internal alarm system, honed by years of cross-examining disingenuous witnesses and picking apart fraudulent claims, immediately went on high alert. It sounded too smooth, too perfectly altruistic. I tried to keep the skepticism out of my voice when I asked her how exactly he was helping with her finances. She waved a dismissive hand, saying he was just explaining how she could make her savings work a little harder for her, that the banks weren't always looking out for the little guy, especially seniors. He understood, she'd said with a grateful sigh. Over the following weeks, David became a constant presence in her narratives. He was always thoughtful, always helpful. He'd set up her new smart TV, explaining it patiently. He'd pick up her prescriptions if she wasn't feeling up to it. He'd even started helping her with her online banking, something she'd always been terrified of. Each story was laced with praise for his kindness, his patience. He was, in her eyes, a saint. Whenever I was due to visit, he'd conveniently just left or had an urgent appointment he couldn't possibly miss. I never got to meet him, which only amplified my suspicions. I pressed her for more details about him. His background, his credentials. She'd get a little flustered, a touch defensive, telling me I was being my usual lawyer self, always looking for the catch. She told me he was a freelance financial consultant, and that he'd tragically lost his own grandmother not long ago, and that she, Grandma Elsie, reminded him so much of her. That particular detail sent a chill down my spine. It was a classic grooming tactic, designed to forge an instant emotional connection. I tried to gently warn her about scams, about people who prey on the elderly, but she wouldn't hear it. David was different, she insisted. He was special. I could feel a barrier going up between us, a subtle wall built by his calculated charm, and it filled me with a helpless dread. I knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that this was going to end badly. The situation began to deteriorate, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Grandma started talking about new investment opportunities David had told her about, exclusive deals that promised incredible returns, far better than her boring old savings account. My blood ran cold. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that these so-called exclusive deals were often the bait used in sophisticated scams. I offered to look into them, demanding the names of the companies, the specifics of the investments. But she became evasive. David, she explained, had advised her it was all very complex, best left to him to manage. He'd even helped her open new online accounts specifically for these ventures, assuring her it was the modern way to handle things. He cautioned her, she said, her voice dropping conspiratorially, against discussing these matters with others, even family. Sometimes, he'd apparently told her, family members could become jealous or try to interfere out of ignorance. Jealous. The audacity of it, the manipulative genius, made my teeth clench. He wasn't just offering bad advice. He was actively isolating her, poisoning her against the very people who cared for her. The next time I visited, a brand new, expensive-looking tablet computer was prominently displayed on her coffee table. It was a gift from David, she chirped, so she could more easily monitor her burgeoning investments. I knew without a doubt that he had set it up, that he had all the passwords, that he was probably the only one who truly understood how to access these investments. My frustration mounted. I felt like I was screaming a warning into a soundproof room. I researched elder financial abuse relentlessly, recognizing David's playbook in every article, every case study. The charm offensive, the creation of dependency, the isolation, the promise of too good to be true returns. It was all there. But every attempt to present these facts to Grandma was met with tears and accusations. I wasn't trusting her judgment. I was being too negative. David was a good man. The chasm he was creating between us widened with every visit, each conversation leaving me more anxious, more certain that disaster was imminent. And then the call came. The one I'd been dreading. Grandma's voice, frail and broken, telling me her bank account, the one holding her entire life savings, was empty. David was gone, his phone disconnected. The money, the bank had informed her with bureaucratic detachment, had been systematically transferred out over several weeks to a series of unfamiliar accounts. The careful facade of calm I usually wore shattered. This was no longer a suspicion. It was a brutal reality. I broke every speed limit driving to her house, my mind a chaotic storm of fury and fear. I found her at her kitchen table, a shrunken figure, tears tracing silent paths down her pale, wrinkled cheeks. The sight of her, so utterly defeated, so betrayed, lit a fire in me. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, calculated rage, the kind that fueled my most ruthless courtroom battles. I held her, letting her cry, whispering reassurances that it wasn't her fault, that these predators were professionals at manipulation. But as I comforted her, my lawyer brain was already dissecting the situation, formulating a plan of attack. First, we contacted the police. An officer came, took a statement, listened with a kind of weary sympathy. He told us these online scams were notoriously difficult to investigate, the money often laundered overseas within hours. He'd file a report, of course, but the unspoken message was clear. Don't expect miracles. The official channels might offer little hope of recovery. My jaw set. Fine. If the system couldn't or wouldn't help, I would. I looked my grandmother in the eye, her gaze still clouded with pain and confusion. I told her, with a conviction that surprised even myself, that I would find him. I would get her money back. And he would pay for what he'd done. I promised her. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. He thought he was clever, disappearing into the digital ether. He had no comprehension of the resources I could command, or the lengths to which I would go when someone I loved was harmed. I began meticulously gathering every shred of information Grandma could recall. Any email addresses David had used, fragments of phone numbers, his physical description, details of the banks involved, login credentials she might vaguely remember for the tablet he'd so generously gifted her. The hunt was on. My apartment transformed. Legal pads covered every surface, my laptop glowed day and night. While Grandma stayed with me, wrapped in a cocoon of my care, I launched my counteroffensive. The official police report was filed, bank fraud departments alerted, but I knew this was a different kind of battle. This required more than procedure. It required cunning. My first target was the tablet. As I suspected, he'd wiped it, but not thoroughly enough. I called in a favor from a brilliant, slightly eccentric cybersecurity expert I'd worked with on a complex white-collar crime case. He delved into the tablet's digital entrails. Hours later, he called back triumphant. He'd found a ghost in the machine. A residual IP address from one of David's initial login sessions when setting up some of the fake investment portals. It was a faint scent, but it was enough. That IP address became my breadcrumb. My friend helped me trace it, cross-referencing it against known compromised servers and dark web forums where fraudsters sometimes bragged or traded tools. It was like sifting through mountains of digital garbage. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of research, analysis, and endless cups of coffee. I scoured social media, using Grandma's somewhat vague description and the fuzzy picture she'd managed to take of him on her old phone, a photo she'd snapped to remember her kind helper by. The irony was bitter. Then a flicker of a match. A profile picture on an obscure networking site. The name was different, David Preston, and the photo was older, more polished, but the arrogant tilt of the head, the coldness in the eyes behind the smile. It was him. The profile was heavily restricted, but he'd made a rookie mistake. He tagged a corporate event photographer in an older, public post. I dived into the photographer's online portfolio, scrolling through hundreds of event photos. And there he was again, Davy, mingling at a charity auction a year prior, his arm around a different elderly woman, both of them smiling for the camera. My stomach churned. He was a serial predator, moving from one trusting victim to the next. The real breakthrough, the piece that locked everything into place, came from tracing a series of small, almost untraceable cryptocurrency transactions he'd made. He was siphoning off portions of his victims' money, including Grandma's, converting it into crypto, likely in an attempt to wash it. One of these transactions, almost insignificant in value, was linked to the registration of a new company, Preston Elite Investments. It was a shell, of course, designed to look legitimate but with no real substance. But a shell company still needs a registered address, a director. And that director was David Preston. He was using this sham entity to funnel the stolen funds into something far more audacious, far more public. A high-end contemporary art gallery in the city's most fashionable arts district. Gallery Preston. He was planning a lavish grand opening in just a few weeks, inviting the city's elite art critics and wealthy potential patrons. He wasn't just a thief. He was an aspiring social climber, trying to buy himself a veneer of respectability with stolen money. His arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, would be his undoing. I now had his real name, his new business, the date and location of his grand debut into polite society. The trap was set in my mind. A cold, precise plan began to crystallize. Simply having him arrested wasn't enough. The humiliation needed to be as public as his aspirations. The The grand opening of Gallery Preston was my stage. I spent the next 2 weeks working with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. I wasn't just building a case for the police. I was crafting a narrative of his downfall. I meticulously documented every transaction, every email, every digital footprint linking David Preston to the stolen funds and, crucially, to the gallery. Through online victim support groups, I managed to connect with 2 other women, one in a neighboring state who had been conned by a man fitting Preston's description, using almost identical methods. Their stories were heartbreaking. With their tearful consent, I incorporated their anonymized experiences into my dossier of his crimes. This wasn't just about my grandma anymore. It was about all of them. I compiled everything into a damning digital presentation. Bank records, transaction logs showing the clear path of money from Grandma's account, and those of the other victims, directly into accounts controlled by Preston, and then into the seed funding for Gallery Preston. I contacted the lead detective on Grandma's case, Detective Miller, a wonderfully ironic coincidence of names, and laid out everything I had. I told him Preston was about to launch an art gallery entirely funded by fraud. I gave him the date, the time, the address. The detective, initially burdened by countless similar cases, was now galvanized by the sheer volume and clarity of my evidence. We coordinated. He and his team would be there. The evening of the gallery opening arrived, a crisp autumn night. I chose my attire with care, a razor-sharp midnight blue pantsuit, heels that clicked with authority on the pavement. Power dressing but also wore paint. Grandma Elsie, her spirit surprisingly resilient, insisted on being nearby. She wouldn't go in, but she waited in the car with a supportive neighbor, her quiet strength radiating even from a distance. She told me she wanted to be there when that monster finally got what he deserved. I walked into Gallery Preston. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of self-important conversations. Sleek, minimalist white walls showcased oversized, bafflingly abstract art. Champagne flutes clinked. And in the center of it all, holding court like a conquering hero, was David Preston. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, that predatory charm turned up to full wattage as he schmoozed with a cluster of what looked like wealthy investors and a well-known local art critic. He looked every bit the successful, cultured gallery owner. He hadn't seen me yet. I let him bask in his stolen glory for a few more minutes, savoring the anticipation. Then I moved. I navigated the crowd, my expression carefully neutral, until I stood directly in front of his little group. I waited for a pause in their conversation. I said his name, Mr. Preston, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the ambient noise. He turned, that practiced, ingratiating smile fixed on his face, ready to greet another admirer. His eyes met mine. The smile faltered just for a fraction of a second. Confusion flickered, then a dawning, horrified recognition which he quickly tried to suppress. He asked if he could help me, his voice a little too smooth, a little too eager. I introduced myself. Sarah Jenkins. I told him I didn't believe we'd had the pleasure of a formal introduction, but that I was certain he knew my grandmother, Elsie Miller. His face, under the gallery's artful lighting, seemed to lose a shade of its confident tan. The investors and the critic looked on with polite curiosity. He stammered that he met so many people it was hard to keep track. Oh, I was sure he did, I replied, my voice still even but now laced with ice. Especially vulnerable, trusting elderly women whose life savings he found so accessible. The polite chatter around us began to die. Heads were turning. I gestured expansively around the pristine gallery. This was quite an achievement, Mr. Preston, I commented. A beautiful space. Built, I added, lowering my voice just enough to make everyone lean in, on a foundation of deceit, theft, and the shattered trust of people like my grandmother. He blustered, his voice rising in pitch, declaring he had no idea what I was talking about. This was a legitimate enterprise, he insisted. He called for security to remove me, this disruptive woman. I just smiled, a cold, thin smile. I told him I didn't think security would be necessary. From my sleek leather briefcase I produced my tablet. With a few decisive taps, the large projection screen at the far end of the gallery, which had been displaying a loop of the featured artist's work, flickered. Then it sprang to life with the title page of my presentation, The Financial Crimes of David Preston, a Case Study in Deception. A collective gasp went through the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I calmly, methodically, walked the stunned audience through the evidence. Scans of bank statements showing Grandma Elsie's savings account being systematically drained. Transaction logs tracing those funds directly into accounts bearing Preston's name, or the name of his shell company, Preston Elite Investments. Then further logs showing the money flowing directly into the startup capital for Gallery Preston. I showed anonymized, heartbreaking quotes from the other victims I'd found, their stories echoing Grandma's. I displayed his fake credentials, the pattern of his predatory behavior. With each slide, David Preston visibly deflated. His face went from ruddy indignation to a sickly, waxy white. His suave composure shattered, replaced by a raw, animal panic. His new associates, the potential investors, the art critic, were slowly backing away from him, their faces a mixture of shock and utter disgust. I concluded by looking directly at him. "You preyed on the vulnerable," I stated, my voice ringing with controlled fury. "You exploited their kindness, their trust. You stole not just their money but their security, their faith in others. You are a con artist, a parasite, and tonight your charade ends." He tried to shout, to deny, to salvage something, anything from the wreckage of his reputation. But his desperate protests were drowned out by the horrified murmurs of the crowd. And then, as if on cue, the main doors of the gallery swung open. Detective Miller, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, strode in. Detective Miller announced, his voice carrying easily over the stunned silence, that David Preston was under arrest for multiple counts of grand larceny, wire fraud, and financial elder abuse. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping onto Preston's wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. His face was a mask of disbelief, then fury, then utter desolation. His carefully constructed world had imploded in the most public, most humiliating way imaginable. As they led him away, a broken man, past the silent, staring crowd, his eyes met mine for a fleeting moment. There was no charm left, no arrogance. Only fear and a dawning comprehension of just how badly he had miscalculated. Justice. It was swift, it was public, and it was deeply, profoundly satisfying. The fallout for David Preston was catastrophic and immediate. His trial was a formality, given the mountain of evidence. He received a significant prison sentence. His name and face were plastered across local news outlets, a permanent brand of shame. Gallery Preston, his monument to stolen dreams, was shuttered, its assets seized. Through aggressive civil litigation, which I pursued with the same tenacity I'd shown in his takedown, we managed to recover a substantial portion of Grandma Elsie's savings. Not every penny, some he'd already squandered, but enough to restore her financial stability and, more importantly, her dignity. The other victims I'd found also benefited, as the case drew wider attention and some of their losses were also pursued. Grandma Elsie, resilient as ever, slowly healed. The experience left scars, of course. She became more cautious, less overtly trusting of strangers, but she refused to let it curdle her inherent sweetness. She called me her avenging angel in a pantsuit, a nickname I secretly cherished. Our bond, already unbreakable, was forged even stronger in the crucible of that ordeal. For me, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a stark, brutal reminder of the darkness that can exist, but also of the power one determined individual can wield against it. The cold fury that had driven me had been channeled into a precise, effective weapon. While my corporate law career continued, I found a new passion for pro bono work, specifically helping victims of financial fraud, especially the elderly. The satisfaction of seeing David Preston's world crumble was immense, but the satisfaction of helping others reclaim their lives, their security, was a deeper, more enduring reward. He thought he'd found an easy target in a sweet old lady. He learned far too late that some grandmas come with a ruthlessly protective lawyer granddaughter, ready to burn down his world to protect her own. And that's a lesson I was more than happy to teach him.